Good. We're going a lot of big topics today. Okay. Anything else we want to throw into the mix? So you got the issues of probabilities. Is the universe so improbable it has to be designed to so what was our second question? Was your question? Was remind me was
The existence of aliens.
hey, would aliens negate if they're intelligent, that's what it negate?
Would that negate the Torah?
significance of
Would that negate the Torah?
Okay, yeah. Okay, totally. To okay. And then we had your question about rabbinic law. Are there footnotes to, and one I put it seems to be the reasons less relevant to the question of Bible criticism and different styles in the Torah itself.
Could I have another one in there?
Why not?
So a lot of anti-Semites like to bring up the theory that, they love to say Jews are a cabal, Jews control everything, and they love to say greater Israel because I guess in the Torah the land promised to Abraham was from the Nile to the Euphrates, right?
Yeah.
Which is, right, like stretching from Iraq to Egypt.
Yeah.
So they love to say, Jews are scheming to get this big plot of land. And I grew up in Israel. I've never heard anybody say, we want to go to Iraq. We want to go to Jordan.
Yeah.
So is there actual merit to that when the Mashiach comes? Will we have greater Israel? Is that something that we want?
Okay. Good. So let's see what we can. I'm going to try and work through them in the order they were asked. But let's see if we're going to try and pace it so we have some time to deal, hopefully, with all of them. Okay. Good. So let's start with the first question: probabilities. It does appear, not so much necessarily about evolution. With evolution, it's harder to work out the exact probabilities, right? But there are definitely many people who will point out that even if there's evidence in a fossil record for a process in the genes for common ancestry and so on, the probability of the process, bless you, given the way we understand the laws of it, producing something as intelligent as us is incredibly low. Others go way before we even look at biology. What's the probability of the universe producing anything ordered in it? Right? If you were to randomly, given the way we understand physics right now, if you were to randomly create big bangs all over the place, you would most likely have universes that either expand and nothing, no matter forms within them, or they just collapse straight back on their gravity and so on. And there's lots of what's called constants that have to be within very, very small, almost vanishingly small ranges for anything to form, right? Matter, antimatter, annihilation to be enough matter. Many constants. Some have calculated the odds of getting anything, not just our particular life form, anything resembling any life anywhere will be something like 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 137, which is a number so absurd that if you started writing once you write 1 over a million, that's very unlike. Once it 1 over a billion, 1 over a trillion, that's just a few zeros. Once you get like 20 zeros, it's impossible. But here we're talking about so many zeros that you'd write one on every particle of the universe and you still wouldn't have written the number. It's like that ridiculous. So that's evidence for a designer. And that is a good argument. It's not a decisive argument simply because we don't have all the laws of physics. So it's a leaning argument. It's like, given the way our universe looks now, it looks extremely designed, even with all the chaotic parts of it. Like, I had a debate several years ago with a big atheistic philosopher called A.C. Grayling. And he said in response to these sorts of arguments, he said a few things. First of all, he said, but there's so much of the universe that appears messy. I don't know if he said that then, he said that another times. And then he said, it's like reverse engineering. In any universe where you would happen to be there, you would say, wow, it's amazing. What's the probability? It's a bit like a puddle saying, what's the odds of the puddle being exactly here? Wherever it will be, that's where it will be. But these arguments are not good counter arguments, because the key is like this. I tell us a bit like here, I gave this analogy as well. Like, some people would say, if I win the lottery, it's a miracle, God must love me, right? Because what's the odds of me winning the lottery? 1 in millions and millions, right? But some have to win the lottery, and whoever would win it would say that. But that's not a good counter argument, because in the case of a lottery, or anything else, a puddle will be there because the ground's low. But in the case of a lottery, every single outcome is equally probable, improbable, significant, and insignificant. There's no more reason why me winning or you winning would be an obvious design or miracle. Somebody somewhere's got to win. In the case of life or any intelligence happening or not happening, that's totally different. Because if you thought a creator was creating a universe, it would make a lot of sense that there should be something intelligent enough to understand that it's been created and have a relation with it. so not all outcomes are equally likely or not. If you were to ask an atheist, the universe about to start, is anything intelligent going to emerge? It will calculate the probabilities. They're impossibly low. No way. If you were to ask a believer, if it's something intelligent creating it, very likely it's creating it for some response. So it's a bit like, I compared it like this. If you take a wad of paint and throw it on a board, and somewhere it says, hello, Rabbi Daniel Rowe, how are you? What's amazing is not that it mentions me. It would be amazing if it said anything intelligent that the average guy reading could say. It happens to be, I'm impressed by it because it mentioned me, but if it said another name, the point is not my name. It's not that I happen to be here. It's that anything emerges from that wad of paint that clearly says an English language sentence, that would obviously be designed. It would not be random. It will be clear that whoever's throwing it, somebody somewhere is manipulating that. Okay? Even if most of it was chaos, by the way, and only a small splodge said it, it would be obvious that either the person who threw it's pulling a trick or somebody who's playing with the board, right? So it doesn't matter, even if only a small part of the universe is intelligent. The fact this universe, where the probability of anything forming with any significant degree of order, able to be remotely intelligent beyond even what we could imagine, right? Even not human, and out of this universe comes somewhere something intelligent enough to understand the universe, to understand its laws, to relate the idea of a creator. When the probability of that is so impossibly low, that's when you start to say, wow, that's impossible. So in order to account for that, so again, I wouldn't say it's a knockout argument about it. It certainly puts, like a lot of atheists would say something like, believing in God's better, believing in a fairy tooth, no, it isn't like a fairy godmother or a tooth fairy or a flying spaghetti monster. No, you can explain the universe perfectly fine without invoking any of these entities. At the moment, the universe looks so absurdly improbably designed that it's clearly pointed to design. I think there's stronger arguments for the existence of God that don't depend on our understanding of physics at all, or probability as well, but that's a separate point. Now, so what's the multiverse approach? The multiverse is a theory that says, or a set of theories that says something like this: perhaps you're right. Perhaps the odds of our universe is being 1 to the 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 137 or some ludicrous number. But maybe there are so many other universes out there, and each universe is different to ours. And each universe, if you've got enough, it's like this. The odds of me throwing the paint and getting hello is nothing. But let's suppose it's 1 in 10 to the power of whatever observed. But if I have that many wads of paint being thrown at boards, that many, then one of them probably will say it somewhere eventually, and that one will all go, oh, it's a miracle, right? Now, there's many reasons why that's not a good argument. But let me just, without getting complicated, just show you, first of all, that it's not a good argument. Just imagine this. Imagine somebody turns up in a courtroom somewhere, and it turns out that they're being sued for cheating in a casino. What's the evidence they cheated in a casino? They went from table to table to table and won. And they played each game and just kept winning. And the odds of that happening are so absurd. They're 1 in quadrillions. They're just, it can't happen. I think any decent judge would say, yeah, this person's cheated. That's it, right? They stand up born all day in the casino. They just keep winning. They call it this, the black and the red, and they're always getting it right. At a certain point, that's clear evidence they cheated. Imagine they said to the judge, I think you've got it wrong. I know the odds are 1 in however many, but there's so many parallel universes to ours. Clearly, in one of them, somebody's going to get this all right. And I just happen to be, and in that one, you'd all think I'm cheating, but I'm in that lucky one. Right? Why would that defense not work? It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same argument if you think about it, isn't it? Right? And there's many, many reasons why it's not. I could go through a lot of different technical points, but the first of all, the simplest thing is our universe is not given a finite amount of probabilities for anything. If you have 2 universes, it would only work if you started with 2 universes. With all these universes that are exactly the same amount of energy and many other constraints that make them statistically relevant to each other. But the simple fact is, if you had however many finite universes you want, there's no probability they'll even start with the same level of energy. The probability any 2 of them even start with the same level of energy is 0.
Why is that now?
Because then they won't be in the same realm to have a probabilistic assessment of one over the other. Right? If I say, watch this, I've got an even better defense to the judge. Forget any other universes. In this universe, there are so many different events happening. One of them is going to be weird. That's useless because what you want is events as similar as possible to this one. Then you can statistically assess the probability, given everything being like this, is 1 in a quadrillion. Now one of them will hit, right? Like rolling the dice. So you need universes to be remotely like ours, and they can start to enter into the same statistical calculations that ours would enter into. And then you'll say, well, if you've got 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 137 that big bang their way in with a similar amount of energy in the first bit, then 1 in X number will produce this type of universe, right? Same number of dimensions. You're going to have certain starting points that allow you to calculate probabilities. Otherwise, they're completely irrelevant. The simple reality is this. According to mathematicians who play with infinities, I think the separate point is a problem. No matter how many universes you have, there will only ever be either a finite number or what's called a countable infinite number, where we can line them up, let's say, in a sequence, right? But the amount of possibilities is infinities upon infinities more than that. You will never, ever, ever be able to actualize all possible universes. So long as you can literally sequentially line them up, right? Here's universe 1, here's universe 2, here's universe 3. You could order them by the amount of energy they have or whatever you want to do. It's like having the natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Are there more for all the natural numbers, there's more points on the tiniest line in the world than there are natural numbers, right? So there's more possible ways universes could be than any actual amount of universes. And since the possibilities are so vastly, literally, right, any constraint that you'll have that any set of universes will obey will, probabilistically just be irrelevant, because the next universe down the road that you're trying to compare to ours won't anything remotely resembling. No reason why I should have any features that are even remotely similar enough to ours. So unless you believe something else, which is no, there's some super constraining structure, right? All these universes emerge in the same structure that constrains them all to be a certain particular. But also at this point, you're starting to realize that this, in order to avoid the design of the universe, what am I doing? I'm invoking all sorts of things that I have no other reason to invoke. And some people say no, because in certain theories of physics, you sometimes get every possibility occurring within certain, let's say, quantum, but that doesn't work either, because that's already, what that's really saying is that's saying that within our particular universe, our enormous amount of other universes, we're talking about how you get those laws in the first place, right? How you get that whole constrained structure in the first place. So what I would say is that is, given the way our universe looks to us right now, the only reason, if this was the final state of physics, the only reasonable explanation is clearly being designed. I wouldn't use that as a knockout argument, that the belief that these other universes that are causally unconnected to ours is explanatorily irrelevant to anything going on inside our universe, mainly because there'd have to be something external to all of them, constraining them to become similar enough that they're relevant to our statistics. And that would therefore collapse it. It's not a good explanation. The best hope you would have if one was agnostic or atheistic, I don't think one could be given that, but at least agnostic, is say, well, maybe we're going to discover laws that will explain all of these things and make them less improbable than they appear to be. That's a possibility, might or might not. But then your honest approach will be, it does look extremely designed, but it maybe will discover something somewhere that makes it look less designed. Right? So your best position will be an agnostic leaning towards belief, but not convinced fully. That would be where you'd go with that. So that's why it is a very strong argument that a purely intellectually honest person would have to say, this does look spookily like something's designing in space, but we might say we're not 100% sure just on the basis of that argument alone. Like I said, I think there's better arguments that don't depend on the particular laws of physics. Okay, so that covers that area. Good. Now, our second topic that we were looking at is if we ever discovered aliens. Now, there's a question that comes up in different forms. According to Torah, could there be other life on other planets, other intelligent life? Right? And the short answer, to the best of my knowledge, and I've asked people greater than me, more than I do, is we don't know. The Torah does not give us much information about what goes on in other planets. It's not a million miles different to the question. It's not very different to, let's say, a few thousand years ago, or even a few hundred years ago, let's go back then, if you were living in Europe at the time and saying, is there intelligent life across the Atlantic Ocean? Whatever they called in this, right? So imagine someone said, does the Torah believe there might be intelligent life on the other side of the ocean? And the answer is, we wouldn't know. There might be or there might not be. But if does that make us less significant? No, not necessarily. It could be that you get there and then you teach them values that the Torah has. It could be they already have one. We wouldn't know till we got there and we found them. So if we do find ever intelligent life in another part of the universe, it could be it has sung down Torah. It could be we may have to teach them. It could be that we each got, Hashem's given us each things that we could teach each other. We'll have to wait and see. And so I don't think anything in Torah would therefore rule out the possibility there might be such intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. And I don't think it would say necessarily that is with that sort of thing. We'll just have to wait and discover. But it wouldn't make us less significant, even if they're more intelligent than us. As long as we're intelligent enough to have a relationship with the creator of the universe, I don't think anything being more intelligent than us would necessarily undermine us having significance and us having a role in God's plan. Happens to be, we're probably about to get very significant intelligence upgrades. So that's going to probably be delivered in the next decade or two or three technologically, but that's a small point. But yes, the fact that something else is vastly more intelligent than us doesn't undermine us any more than a human being with a relatively low IQ is not rendered less significant, or is because somebody else out there has a much higher IQ and more musical and more physically able than them. That doesn't determine our significance, right? As long as we are significant enough, as long as we are capable of making positive choice in this world, relating to the idea that there's a creator and a will and so on, that gives us infinite significance already.
But you don't think that it would discredit the Torah in that if, like, there was no mention of aliens in the 7 days of creation? The Torah is, maybe I'm over-interpreting, but it comes with the assumption that the life forms that Hashem created, right? He starts the plants and the trees and the animals, and then he gets to man. And so there's no mention of, and it's kind of like a list of intelligence and free will. And so to see a whole other life form after all these years of assumption and then belief in that, wouldn't that discredit the Torah?
Not really, because the Torah is a story about the human beings and what our job is, right? It doesn't mention lots of species and not mention the Torah, because the Torah is not a law for those species, law for us. So you might then be right in that if these beings are vastly more intelligent than us, it's such a way, it's possible the Torah laws wouldn't be relevant to them. Right? So it's possible God would have a different kind for that. That it could be. It's not impossible that elsewhere in the universe, God has, just like even with the Torah, we don't say non-Jews are meant to keep the Torah. They can get a portion of the world to come. So not everybody has the same laws, and it's possible there's other beings in other parts of the universe that Hashem's given a different lot of laws to. Not impossible. That we'll have to wait and see. Far the excitement of discovering more about our universe. Are we the only intelligent beings in it? Are there others in it? All exciting stuff. Okay, what was our third question was rabbinic. So you had your hand up. I'm so sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, why is it the Torah that doesn't mesh in with that?
Okay, good. Rabbinic laws, right? Get out clauses. So this is a very interesting question. There are certain rabbinic laws, because when the first of all, where does rabbinic law come from? Right, let's start with that. I don't know if that was dealt with in the talk previously. A little bit. It's from the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 17. There the Torah says, what do you do if you don't know the law between what's called dam and adam, doing the difference between different blood types, where there's laws relevant to that, between different justice principles when that's relevant, or a whole different areas where you might not know the law. Now, the obvious answer is read it in the Torah, but it's clearly talking about where it's not black and white in the Torah, which is lots of areas of life. The Torah gives a lot of principles, but not usually details of how to apply those principles and laws, and there's a lot open to interpretation. So when you don't know, you get up and you go to the Kohen. If it's certain laws, it'll be the priest in the temple will decide it, or the judges, that's other laws. And then it says, Al-Pia Torah sheyerucha, according to the Torah that they teach you, which means they can interpret the Torah. And then it says, V'mitzvah sheyom l'chotasa, and any law they tell you to do, right? You can't deviate to the right or the left. So that means that they can either interpret the Torah or legislate. This body of elders is given the authority on interpretation and the ability to enact legislation And that is what rabbinic law is. So rabbinic law is actually biblical law. Forget the word rabbi. The elders of the nation of Israel are empowered. So you've got the written laws. You've actually got an oral tradition of the definitions of words in the Torah as well. What the meaning of where it says don't do melacha on Shabbat. What does that mean? Or where you put totafot between your eyes. What does that mean? So we've got those. Those are called the law given to Moshe at Sinai. And then you've got this body of elders wherever there's flexible interpretation or more than one plausible interpretation. Either the priests, if it's temple law, or the elders, if it's any other law, will decide the law. They will decide the interpretation. And on that, by the way, it could be come with a different interpretation, different generations. Right? Now, Maimonides says explicitly in Rambam says it's in Hilchos Mammon, the law, right, where he discusses the laws of how these things work. And also they have the right to legislate. So now, conceptually, the reason for that is because, I mean, there's many reasons you give. It allows the Torah to be applicable all the time, but much more importantly, it's a bit like a relationship. Every relationship works the same way. Anyone who wants a relationship with you, the more intense the relationship, if the friendship will come with rules. You may not explicitly articulate them, but you are only going to make friends with certain people, and you're going to intensify friendships with certain people, and there's going to be unwritten behavioral codes in those friendships. You might not be conscious of them, but you're going to behave certain ways when you get close to people, and some people you can't get too close to because their rules just don't work with you, right? And others you can. And if you want to get into, let's say, a lifelong, like a marriage relation, that's going to come with an enormous set of unwritten rule book. It's going to determine where you live. It's going to determine what jobs you have, whether you work at night or day. It's going to determine the way you speak to one another. It's going to determine how the carpets look on the floor of it's going to determine everything, right? Or what deodorant you use, where you go on holiday, everything. How many children you have, it's every single part of life. It's like laws, but it's not law. Law is emergent from the relationship. And in the relationship, there will be three broad categories of laws. One that your partner has because of who they are. Anyone who wants to marry them or anyone who wants to marry you, there's certain givens, right? It may be you want to be a Torah observant Jew. That anyone who wants to marry you has to fit into that. That's already comes out. Maybe you have to be an American. Yes, it may be whatever is you're passionate about, and many other micro details as well will just be given by the fact to you. Then there'll be interpretations. That is, there's more than one possible way to have a relationship with you. And one person will have it one way, and one person will have it another, and one person will have it a third way. That's like interpretation, when the Torah has more than one possible truth that can be delivered with it. And finally, it will become rules that whoever you marry, you bring into commitments you bring in. She can't deal with you being 5 minutes late, so you always come 5 minutes early, not on time. So you bring in your own legislation to it. And when you bring it in, it comes with a commitment. And there, by the way, if the biblical elders who are the Torah's court and parliament, basically, make a law on our behalf, it cannot be undone without being repealed by a similar body of elders. Okay. So now the rabbis made a law at a time. So the last time we ever had a collective, all the elders together, was basically the Talmud being written. Before then, it was the Mishnah being written. And even then, it wasn't a full. In the Second Temple, we called these elders Sanhedrin. That was the word we used. It's a Greek word for the assembly. And the Mishnah was kind of an attempt to do something like it, although they couldn't vote on everything and decide all the laws. So they just wrote down all the things still being debated. The Talmud does a similar thing. Anything they definitively rule on is binding for us. Okay? So we've got this literature now. And now what happens if they tell us a law and they give us a reason? So sometimes they will explicitly attach the law to the reason. And the law will only apply so long as the reason is there. And if the reason ever goes, the law will go. But other times they give us the law and independently they give us a reasoning process. But we weren't there when everything was being deliberated. So we know there'll be a lot more factors than the ones they give us. This happens, by the way, in secular legal systems, not to exactly compare, but there's some comparison we can make all the time. A parliament, a congress, someone will have legislated something. So a judge will want to say, well, I want to go into their argument. Usually the legal thing, as it's codified in law, is its primary meaning. The fact that so-and-so wanted it because in their constituency something was going on is not that relevant. This is the law that came to the statute. So similar thing happens with the rabbinic law, generally speaking. Now, I'll give you an example where this comes to debate. There's a very famous question in rabbinic law. you couldn't drink milk if you didn't have someone Jewish observing the entire process to give us 100% certainty that we know there's nothing mixed into it. Now, the question is that because we're worried that there's pig's milk in it, or is it that's a legislation and its original motivation was partly or largely based on that? So on that basis, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein famously ruled that nowadays, when you have government legislation, health factors and so on, that it's like we're witnesses because we can testify that there's no way there's anything else in the milk. And so we clearly fulfill the purpose of the Rabbinic legislation even without physically being there. And some others disagreed and said, no, the legislation stands independent of that, and therefore you still have to have the Jewish witnesses. That's an example of where we're not sure. Now, you brought up two examples. One is the horse riding on Shabbat, because you might break a twig. And you want to say that doesn't apply nowadays, so you should be able to ride horses on Shabbat. I have news for you. It never made more sense than it does now. Thousands of years ago, when people rode horses, they didn't go snapping twigs. That wasn't a standard practice. And in fact, in the laws of Shabbat, you'll see this very often. The rabbis forbade swimming, right? They forbade smoking things that were considered medicinal in those for medical purposes. They used to grind things out. They forbade musical instruments in case you come to repair them. Throughout most of history, none of these were highly probable events, right? So I don't remember which source this comes from. I remember Rabbi Verka is quoting it, Al-Shiba quoting it, but I don't remember where it comes from. It's also, so you'd have to forgive me. There's a very nice idea. I don't think this is black and white written by the rabbis themselves. They said they felt or they'd heard or there was some teaching somewhere, but it makes a lot of sense, that the rabbis were motivated to make Shabbat not a holiday. Shabbat is a day of very powerful spiritual work. Right? One of the Midrashim, the Tanna of Eliyahu, says, quotes the biblical verse, Yawim Yitzar v'lo echad mehem, God made many days and kept one for himself, as saying, he gives lots of interpretations of it, but it says that one example is Shabbat. You've got the week where we're all so busy just trying to make an income that we don't have time to do the most meaningful things in the world. And therefore God says, okay, but I'll give you one day where you can dedicate to what you're living for. Spend time with your family, spend time with God, you can rest as well, but it's a day of you don't have anything else but what you're really living for. Everything else you're cut off from. Now, what are you living for? Now let's see how you live. So Shabbat is that day of what really matters. Your time with God, your time with wisdom, your time with yourself, your time with your loved ones, your time with your community. What matters to you? What is, like Rabbi Sachs in England once said, who was the chief rabbi of England, said, on Shabbat, one of the things you can't do is spend money, and therefore you can't acquire or interact with things that have price. And therefore you have a day of doing that which is priceless. Right? This is Shabbat. And a lot of that, and the rabbis said, look, a person could, what we really want to do is make sure people don't use this day for holiday. Use Sunday for that, right? Or use that. So don't do just the normal sort of recreational things, riding horses, playing music, going swimming, all those sorts of things, smoking whatever you smoke. Don't do those things. And yes, technically they had to link them to possible violations because they don't go, they want to usually link it to the biblical, to protective worlds around the things God's already said. So there is a link between them and the nearest connective malacha. But if it was just the probability that you might come to break Shabbat, they'd have picked a lot of other things. They picked those because they particularly don't want you to go on a holiday that day. They want it to be a day on, not a day off. Right? So, okay, that may be true, that may be not true. It's a nice idea. I don't know, again, the source of the idea, but it does make sense. But it shows you the type of example of the rabbis make a legislation, they link it to a biblical prohibition, but that's not necessarily the full extent of the picture they're bringing to bear. Right? You gave an example of second day Yom Tov. So somebody says, second day, why do we have to keep 2 days of Sukkot and Shavuot and Pesach, all right, all these holidays outside of Israel? It made sense in ancient times because they didn't have a fixed calendar. And therefore, you had to wait for witnesses to come to Jerusalem. So in the biblical times, when you waited for the witnesses to come to Jerusalem, it took a few days for the news to travel. You came 2 years. Well, by the time the rabbis enacted it, we had calendars. So they say it might return to where it was. Okay, but what they're clearly saying to you is, and by the way, they're not just legislating that we should be the way we used to be. In ancient biblical times, you kept 2 days Yom Kippur. Right? If you keep 2 days Rosh Hashanah, 2 days Sukkot, it means you're living in a place where the news didn't get there for 50 days. So what did you have in Yom Kippur? So biblically, you can eat tiny amounts in Yom Kippur. You basically eat tiny amounts for 2 days. You fasted for 2 days, or very, very little food for 2 days, right? So we don't do that nowadays. And in biblical times, you never kept 2 days of Shavuot. Why? Because Shavuot's always 50 days after Pesach. Certainly by the time 50 days were there, you all got the news when Pesach had been. So what they did is they created an approximate map. Almost the same, not exactly the same. And the reason is they want you to function and remember what it's like, that the ideal of the Torah is not that you're using calendars. The ideal is there's witnesses coming to Jerusalem, and the further you live from Jerusalem, the less clear the calendar is. And so they enact it on that basis, and they want you to remember that. And yes, there's many different motives involved. Like there are parts of the world where the calendar could be lost or what. That's not the only driving force. And therefore, once again, our calendar is independent of how good our technology and recording systems of the calendar is. So we always have to be careful with rabbinic legislation, assuming we know the full extent of what's going on. And unless, therefore, they enacted the law saying explicitly that it is in situation A, do X, and therefore you're not in situation A, you don't need to do X. There are cases like that. So, for example, many believe that the enactment that you should read the Torah and translate it into Aramaic was conditional on being in a world where people spoke Aramaic. It was so the Aramaic speakers, which is most Jews, could understand it. So many argue today it doesn't apply. Yemenite Jews still do it. The rest of us generally don't. Although many people do it privately, but not, yeah. So that's an example where it could be, there are cases like that. But for the most part, they just say, here is the law. And you can read some of the reasonings. We don't assume that the law is tied to the reasonings given. And we have to wait for another Sanhedrin of the future to come along in the Messianic era to decide whether we maintain it or not. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next question was Bible criticism. Does the Torah have different styles of authorship? So the first thing to note is, the first question is, does it actually have different styles of authorship?
Yes, it seems.
Are there examples you're thinking of?
Yeah, by cross seems to be written in a clear style.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good. Good. So Vayikra is the third book of the Torah. It appears to be in a different style. Do you have more specific things, or just the feeling as you go through?
I mean, I was reading an article they analyze like word frequency and then grammar.
Good. Good. So let's go back a little bit in the classic good, because that maybe a few steps into the real depth of discussion. Good. Now let me explain what's going on here. Original biblical criticism, it's hard to pinpoint an exact beginning point, but let's say I was struck and all the way down to Julius Wellhausen. Right, so talking really mostly develops, let's say, in the 1800s, a little bit before then, was started by noticing that sometimes the Torah appears to tell a story twice, right? Occasionally it appears to start something and stop it halfway, right? Its writing style is not the same as our writing, natural human writing style would be. And particularly in the book of Genesis, you get a few times where there appears to be double stories, like the 7 days of creation and then the Garden of Eden story. That seems to indicate the world's created in a single day. During the flood, there seems to be, God talks to Noah and says, there's going to be this flood. And then he talks to him again and says it's going to be a flood. And critics started to notice that sometimes when you get these double stories, one of them has the 4-letter name of God and one of them has the word Elohim, the other name. So they started to hypothesize maybe there were once 2 texts, what they call the J text, which is J is Yah, the sound, the 4-letter name of God. And one is the E text, Elohim. And there were different religious traditions, and at some point somebody wove them together. And then hypotheses began to emerge. Maybe this correlates to when the kingdom was split in 2. And maybe different tribal traditions emerged. And they started to notice that in these so-called J texts, there was a lot of stories about places like Hebron, and sometimes the E texts talk about Shechem. So maybe you could see his geographical distance, and maybe there were 2 religious traditions. And later when the northern kingdom collapsed and they came south, somebody like Chizkiyahu, the king, kind of wove them together and wanted both traditions together, and they were similar enough that you could take chapter 1 from one, chapter 1 from the next, or chapter like that, and explain things like that. That was kind of how biblical criticism began. Then, as people began to test this hypothesis across the Torah, it often broke down. It didn't quite work what you expect the J to say, and a particular discovery where there's a whole style of writing, the whole book of Vayikra, of Leviticus, only uses the name Hashem, the four-letter name of God, so theoretically J, but it seems to have features that are very different. And they came up with this idea there's actually a P, a priestly author. Why a priestly author? Probably because only a priest would really care that much about the details of the temple and the tabernacle. And then it's not just in that little book already when the tabernacle is first instructed towards the end of Exodus, towards the end of Shemos, that this is also P. And then over the years, people realize Devarim, Deuteronomy is also written. It seems to be in a different style, different vocabulary, and so on, right? And then people start saying, well, we can actually spot some P texts in the book of Genesis, maybe even Genesis chapter 1 and various things like this. And this is how biblical criticism formed. And the standard model is called JEPDR. J is the J text, E is the Elohim text, T is the priestly text, D is the Deuteronomistic text, and R is a redacted, put them all together. And then as they study more and more and more, lots of things became less clear, because in the middle of this supposed P text, you've actually got a whole bunch of laws that emerge, and the styles very Ani Hashem. So maybe there's an H author as well. And there's lots of variation and different possibilities and debates and so on. Okay. In recent years came along, and by the way, within the academic world, certainly from the 1980s and even earlier, I mean, there were always people who argued against this and showed problems with a lot of these hypotheses. But of course, you're dealing with such a hypothetical, and the text is, it's hard to pin down exactly. And some people thought that was, a problem. Some people thought not so much. Around the 1980s, a lot of academics began to question the theory on a lot of sort of grounds we would, people could push back against the theory. One problem is, obviously we don't have the original text, so there's nothing to work off scientifically, but it's like anytime you create a single, that you expect these particular cluster of words, they appear somewhere else. It's not a very easily rigid theory. But much more than that, what the author's claiming, what the hypothesis is that a redactor is able to weave together lots in these texts on the assumption that people don't. They're not like as religious as we will be today about their text. You can't change it or tamper it. Those days, they were more willing to add bits, combine bits. People the priests wouldn't have rebelled against this process. And yet the original texts are so perfectly preserved that they maintain exactly the same lists of verbs and clusters uncontaminated. So there's a bit of a problem there. What do we think the psychology of ancients were? They perfectly preserved texts, or they were quite happy to play fast and loose? That's a classic example I think Robert Wybray brings up in who wrote the Pentateuch. Lots of people point out there appear to be these sorts of problems and contradictions. Also, you got lots of times where the name Hashem Elohim appears together. Like, for example, in the Garden of Eden story, the name Hashem Elohim actually appears together all the way until the serpent comes along and splits the names up. Then the names split up, and then they come back together again. It's like almost like that's the real presentation of God. The serpent intervenes, splits them, while the woman's talking to them. She actually only used the name Elohim. Then we hear the voice of Hashem Elohim coming back into the garden, and man hides from the double name of God. That's literally what the verse says. So this, the narrative seems to be around these. You can't explain that, and different authors. It doesn't work. And then the names split through the book of Genesis, and then they come back together again. For example, when we stand at Mount Sinai, ready to receive God's presence, he opens with the words, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem, your God. The names come back together again. And then we lose that level of the golden calf, Eiledo Hafi Yisrael. And the whole book of Deuteronomy is Moses pleading to bring those two names together. Shema Yisrael, listen, Israel, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, God is one. So the actual whole narratives going around these names, it's very hard to do that out of weaving random text together or even non-random text together. But the real test came with computer science. So the first attempt at computer science was done in the 1980s. By a team of researchers, papers published by what's called Rade et al. In those days, it took a very, very long time to run a text through a computer. So they only managed to do it on the book of Genesis. They took all the things they thought were J, E, P, and their conclusion was when you run it through sophisticated computers that are better, that the problem with this is like this. Computers are better than humans at this, even from the 1980s, because humans suffer from confirmation bias. If I believe two texts are separate, if I took any literature in the world and started teasing out chapters, probably I'd find a cluster of verbs end up in one side and not the other, right? Certain nouns, or just randomly. And I started, oh, wow, look at those verbs. They're there, not there. Those nouns. How statistically significant is it? Human instinct is not good at answering that. Machines are much better at answering that. So they began to have plagiarism software already in the 1980s that could look, for example, for the average verb length. The sort of thing humans aren't conscious of, but if two different authors were there, you would notice. A certain sentence length, certain structural points. And the conclusion of that research in the 1980s was that the J and E divisions are not real. They're the same author. Even though stories are here in it, it's the same author. The style's too identical. This is not a northern author, a southern author. However, the P texts are different. Now, why would that be? So first of all, let's just talk from a classical Jewish perspective, and then I'll get into more up-to-date research, okay? So classical's 1980s is not the most up-to-date research. From a Jewish perspective, imagine we believe Hashem wrote the Torah. Not imagine, we do, right? I do. So Orthodox Jews believe Hashem wrote the Torah. Do we expect the whole thing to be in one style? The answer, definitely not. Why not? Because, for example, the book of Deuteronomy is 4 speeches of Moses. We don't expect Moses to use the same language, the same verbs and things that God would use. So, and God said, write those 4 in the Torah. Okay, so clearly we all expect Deuteronomy, Devarim to be very different. Fine, or at least we do. Then, whoever's writing a text, right? Whoever's writing a text, you have a different style of writing. If I looked at all the things you write, every email you write, okay, nowadays you might ask ChatGPT to write every email you write, right? But even then, when you write it to a friend, you'll even tell it, write in a nice style. You know, when you're writing a legal document, you'll write in a legalistic style. So we don't necessarily expect the legal components of Torah to be written in the same style as the narrative components. We might expect different types of verbs and adjectives, different average sentence lengths, different topics to be raised. The way you write about them is different. So, and in particular, when it comes to the temple, right, the Mishkan, which is a very central piece of Torah, between it and the service there, you could imagine a very different set of words because your religious mode when you're there is very different. So, for example, the word, when you had the early days of offerings, and the Hebrew word used was zevach, which is literally means an offering, a sacrifice. Once the temple comes in, we more often than not use the word karban, which is an act of coming close to God, because there is a specific type of service you can only do in the temple. You can't do it outside, right? So there's certain types of materials and minerals that are only mentioned in the context of the temple, never mentioned anywhere else. Certain type of artisanship that is only discussed in the construction of the temple. So now, after the 1980s, lots of critics wrote in, different papers and so on. And there was a guy called Richard Elliot Friedman who wrote a critique of that original experiment and said, well, first of all, how do you decide what's J, E, and P? You didn't use my research. I've got a different theory. And so on. The second, and so, okay. So more recently, there's much more sophisticated with AI and stuff like that. And there was actually a paper published a few years ago, I forget exactly which year it was published. And there were headlines all over the world. If you look, you probably still find it online. There's a guy called Moshe Koppel, a whole bunch of people who were involved in this research. And the headlines were computer proves Bible criticism. I actually remember at the time I was teaching on a Jewish program in New York, and literally as the day I saw that, I happened to be getting on a plane back to England for a few days, and I was very ready to. I remember in my head think, wow, if computer actually proved humans were in the Torah, that is real scientific, irrefutable proof. I have to rethink, am I going to carry on teaching Torah? Anyway, but I do what I always try and do this, forget the newspaper headlines, find the original paper, look it up, get in touch with authors. And I got in touch with a bunch of authors and I would read through the paper myself. And when I read through the paper, it did not seem to me that's on the paper proven at all. So I reached out to the authors of the paper and they pretty much, the main author, I think, or the first one written, so he said to me, I don't think that is the conclusion of the paper. What had the paper show? That what they did is they'd already been able to prove if you randomly mix texts. I think they took Zechariah and Yechezkel, Ezekiel, which everybody assumes are single authors. They randomly mix them and the computer could tear them apart with like a 90-something% degree of accuracy, very high 90s. So it's clearly very good at teasing out different authors. So they said to them, okay, imagine there's 2 authors in the Torah. Obviously didn't bother with Deuteronomy, that's clearly different. How would it look? What happens to there's 3 authors? What happens if there's 4 authors, 5 authors, 6 authors? It can't tell you how many authors there are. But given if there are these authors, how would you split the Torah? And what it came up with was something like 90% of its division was the same as Richard Friedman's division to P and non-P. Oh, so that proves... Okay, so why is that not true? Because 90% of what's called P is stuff that talks about the temple. Really, all they proved is temple, the vocabulary and the nouns and things used about the temple are different to when you're talking about the general stories. But the most important is this. Not just Freeman, but many Bible critics, big thing is their point was, but we found similar styles to P in narrative parts of Torah. That already looks like a different author. But incredibly, this software proved that all of those narratives that don't talk about the temple are not written by that author. Do you see? It means, like, for example, Genesis chapter 1. The computer said that's definitely not the same author as the P, even though that's like a very standard for, lots of those things in the book of Genesis, almost none of them supposedly would, if there's two authors, would be the P author. It basically splits almost 100% the discussions about the Mishkan, the tabernacle and the service, and non, which is exactly what we'd predict would happen. Then they sent it looking for J and E. What happens if there's 4 authors, or 5 authors, or 6, or 7, or 8, and then it just randomly divides the Torah. It never splits along J and E, ever. Which means that J and E was a figment of human imagination. There actually is not evidence for it. Of course, there'll be verbs and adjectives, lands and places, but it's all random. If it was real authors, there would be actual markers that don't exist. So supposed J and E chapter are not different authors. So why is Genesis 1 and 2? There must be an internal reason, an internal logic, right? Why these stories, and we can of course explain them. There are plenty of beautiful commentary that's been exactly why it fits perfectly to do that, but it's definitely not different authorship. Okay, so really speaking, I think the best modern research, the correct conclusion is that the whole biblical critical model is wrong. Means the best conclusion, and that yes, there are different verbs, adjectives, and so on used when we describe how we relate to God, how we build, construct, and deal with the temple, and how we relate to God in that most intense place versus outside. But that's it.
Okay, so more specifically in this study, one of the specific words they analyzed was the usage of Anochi versus Ali.
Yeah.
Anochi was pretty much reception, but pretty much just using in Bereshit and not the rest of the Torah, and then he was using the rest of the Torah and not really Bereshit.
First of all, it's not. I mean, Anochi is used, for example, in the Ten Commandments, which is not in Bereshit. I could do. I'm not familiar with that particular. That's probably not the same paper, I'm afraid. But I could do right now. Let me just do right now a word search. We can look up Anochi and Ali. I will tell you that Umberto Cassuto already, early 20th century, wrote a whole piece on the difference in the text where Anochi comes up and Ani. Generally speaking, I'll give you the rule that I think is correct is Ani is just usually first person singular. Anochi is a much more existential assertion of self. So, for example, Adam after the sin existentially asserts himself by saying, "Irak yera manochi." I am, I feel this way. Or God, while he's presenting himself in relation to Zanochi Hashem Elokecha, right? So that's generally, I think that's a very good rule for looking through Torah. So if you want to show me the specific paper, the specific research, I'm happy to comment on it. But I'd rather look at it, think about it, and comment. And I think we could just do word search to go through. But instinctively, I do remember that's a very compelling explanation as far as I remember. And as the Anochi Ani distinction is much, much older than modern research, but I think his explanation does a lot better than the multiple authorship theory. If I remember correctly, almost whatever you try to divide the Torah, you'll end up with Anochis and Adis in the wrong places, right? But again, happy for you to share with the research. We'll talk about Tim and those. Yeah.
Why is there an underlying assumption that Hashem would only write in one writing style?
Okay,
I don't even do this.
Good, excellent. So that's what I point out. We don't write in monolithic text. And there's no reason why Hashem would. Was very interesting. Rabbi Mordechai Breuer was a rabbi again. He wrote it on this. I haven't seen anything recently. But anyway, Rabbi Mordechai Breuer, he argued that even if you could prove there were multiple styles in Torah, that's assuming you're thinking humans might write in multiple styles. First of all, humans do. And second of all, God could deliberately write in multiple styles because just like a very talented human, or even more than normal, like, yes, humans might subconsciously not be, you might be able to tell it's the same author across the different styles and God could do it better. There's no reason why God couldn't, in principle, speak in multiple voices. I'm just saying that in which case, multiple voice wouldn't prove its human authorship anyway. That is his argument. Others would disagree and say, but if it really looks like especially when they wanted to try and say certain things seem to date better in one text or another, they appear to be different times. Biblical criticism was not just one piece of information. I've cut it a bit short here. They tried to go here with archaeological knowledge, and they tried to line up when the texts are written, and they wanted to argue certain texts 8th century BCE and later and so on, then it would look more messy. But I agree with you. If all you had is Torah appears to be in different human styles, then it could easily still be divine. But if it's all in one style, then the whole biblical principle model.
With the time thing as well, though, that's also perfectly doable. Like, whether it's a human author or whether it was divinely given, if I wanted to write in Shakespeare language, I could do that.
You could, but you probably wouldn't. A really good machine would probably always tell you it's not quite Shakespeare.
That's true.
Now, in terms of the tiny cliff, now Hashem could. So I happen to have, we've spoken here, I've talked about this a few times, and I've got a video series on the whole claims about archaeology, which turn out to be wrong as well. The claims that certain texts that are using information that's at the wrong time actually turn out not to be accurate. At least I think so. And then again, happy to talk about, and not again, we're out of time now, but maybe in another session we talk about it. I spoke about it a few weeks ago here as well, and happy to do that again. Okay, to go through that again. There was still a question I haven't answered, isn't there? Was in your last question about the Greater Israel.
Yes.
So I don't know the answer to it. It seems, generally speaking, whenever halacha comes up and talks about the borders of Israel, it never includes anything about this Greater Israel, right? It's very likely that part of Hashem's vision, remember, Hashem has a vision not just for the Jewish people, but in the end for the whole of mankind. For example, there's a vision, I think in Yeshayahu, about Egypt coming to serve Hashem, which has happened already. Monotheistic religion fulfills a lot of this. We forget this, that monotheistic religion, right? In the days of the Torah, everything was idolatrous in the whole world. And for a long time afterwards, we were the only monotheists in town. Certainly the only abstract monotheists. There were Hainatheists, there were those who believed in many gods, worshipped one. We were the monotheists, and all the ethical stuff that comes with monotheism, and all the way they ordered mankind as the image of God, and all this kind of stuff. We were the only Shem town for a very, very long time. And God is saying that this whole land will have that view. Now, in the Messianic era, it's possible all the residents in New Israel will want to become a part of the nation of Israel. That's possible. That's not something we have ever had an obligation to impose, even in the one time where we did have to have wars over the land, which was the original conquest, because the inhabitants wanted to keep idolatry going, right? But that was the only time. We don't have an obligation to have wars to conquer the land nowadays. There's an obligation to defend ourselves wherever we are, especially if we're in the land, but we don't have an obligation to go conquering lands, and certainly not to expand anywhere beyond any borders that were given. There's not even a holiness to anything beyond those borders. So it might be a vision for the Messianic era. It might be that's why there'll be very intense monotheism and love of Hashem. It might be where the nations first take on some kind of quasi-Geritoshof relationship where they come under the Torah. But all those lands are Muslim anyway, and Muslims are without a doubt observers of the seven Nochai. I shouldn't say without a doubt. There's a minority of opinions that argue, but mostly people have never really met Muslims. Right? If we know Islam well, then we understand that it's an observance of the Noahide law. Does it qualify for the Rambam's criteria, Geritoshof? Maybe, maybe not. That's not the relevant point for us. So, to some degree, all our lands come under the worship of Hashem already. Right? So, it's much further than that land. So, what's the specific boundaries? Very, very likely, and by the way, it's all Abraham's children, right? To the extent to which we believe that at least spiritually, the Muslim world is Ishmael. So, but it is possible there'll be a more intense relationship with the Torah in those boundaries. That's likely to be nearer for the Messianic era. It's certainly not anything we'd be pursuing. And that's why you grow up in Israel, you grow up anywhere, and you will never meet anybody talk about going to get those boundaries, because that's absolutely not one of our ambitions or agendas. It's certainly a prophecy which we'll understand in the Messianic era comes about. And that's for God to engineer, nothing to do with us. But it is interesting, they're not just in those boundaries, but in both directions. See, in the ancient world, and this I will finish with, in the ancient world, those were the places of civilization, the Nile to the Euphrates, and they were the epicenter not just of idolatry, but all the immorality that comes with that. Ultra-hierarchical and abusive society, very sophisticated society. First places where language evolved, social complexity evolved, but extreme power-oriented societies, which deified humans and humanified the gods in a very intense way. And with all the vice that came with that, every human vice became a virtue. Right? So your drives of power and control became part of what the pantheon, what the gods were dealing with, and part of what power and divinity was considered the same thing. And Abram walks into the world in a relationship with God that says that's not how the world is. And later, through the revealing of prophets, dreams of a world where everyone's at peace. And you don't say a ruler is glorious of other people, right? And we don't say there should be poor meant to be poor. All this revolution starts from here and reaches out to the Nile and Euphrates and has already gone way. Will there be an even more intense thing? Maybe in the Messianic year. Okay, so that's where we'll finish today.